Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our National E-Invoicing Solution workshop. In this workshop, we're going to showcase how to access and use the Compliance and Enablement Toolbox and SDK. This is an important step in the journey of being Phase 2 compliant with e-invoicing. This is an optional step. However, we urge you to use this tool to make sure that whatever e-invoices that you're generating for your solution is compliant with ZATCA standard. So to access the SDK, you need to navigate to sandbox.zatca.gov.sa and log in using your email. You're going to be presented with 4 tabs. The first tab is about the developer portal frequently asked questions. We keep populating this question depending on the most frequent question that we receive from our developers. The second part, which is the compliance and enablement toolbox and SDK. This will be our topic today. Also today, we're going to quickly touch upon the web-based validator for non-technical users and how to use it to validate the XML files using the web. And then finally, you'll be able to access the API integration sandbox, which we'll be covering in a different session. So to access the SDK, basically you need to click on this tab. In the first tab, you will be able to download the user manual and the SDK itself. You're going to have access to a support page. We'll explain to you how to install the SDK and what are the prerequisites for that. And then you'll also have access to all documentation related to the technical specifications. So you'll have the XML implementation standards, the security implementation standard, and the data dictionary standards as well. And then finally, we'll have access to the version history of all the SDKs. Each version will include what changed in that version, along with a direct link to access the SDK. So once you download the SDK, you're gonna unzip the file and you'll be presented with this structure. Basically, for Windows, you're gonna need to run the install.bat file, and for Linux and Mac, you're gonna need to run the install.sh file. One of the most important files we have here is the README file, which is in Word document and PDF format. So in that file, you'll have all the details that you need for using the SDK. So to verify that you have installed the SDK correctly, what you need to do is through command line, you need to run the Fatura-help to see all the commands supported by the SDK. Now, the SDK can be used in 2 modes. The first one is using the command line, as we were going to see today. The other one is to import the libraries that we have with the SDK and integrating it with your IDE for .NET development environment or Java development environment. So on the README file, we're going to have all the commands that you can run in the SDK and along with all the options. Also, you're going to have some examples of how to run these commands. So let's go through them. The first command that you can run, which is the certificate signing request, the CSR. Before you run this command, you need to configure the properties file that comes with the SDK to be specific to your organization. So there are certain fields that need to be populated. I'm going to have a look at that in the folder structure shortly. So basically, you need to provide some information about the device and the organization that is going to be used to sign or register the device in ZATCA. Of course, we have provided some example in the SDK. Once you have populated the configuration file, you need to run the command fatura-csr config and pass it the file path. And then we're going to need to pass it the private key with the file path. And then finally, you need to pass it the where you want the file to be generated. The next command, which is to generate the invoice hash, which is one of the requirements for phase 2. Basically, what you need to do is run the command fatura-sign-invoice to and pass it the file name, and then the output file, which is the signed invoice, and the file name where you want it. Another command that we have, which is to generate a JSON format of the API request. So basically, you run the command fatura-invoice and then pass it the file name, and then the output file name, and then the API request file name as well. This will generate the file in a JSON format, which is used in the integration later on. Another important command that we have, which is generating the QR code. As you know, part of the requirement for e-invoicing is to generate a QR code for the simplified invoices. And here we provided a sample and a command to showcase how this QR code can be generated. Basically, you run the command fatura-qr-invoice and then pass it the file name. The output of that was going to be the actual QR code that you can use to print the QR code on the invoice. Another important command, which is the validate invoice. This will validate the XML that you're passing and get the result whether it's successful or failed. And if it fails, it's going to show exactly where it failed. So basically you run the command fatura-validate-invoice and pass it the file name to be validated against. This is how to generate the invoice hash, fatura-generate hash, and then invoice, and then the file name. And then here we have some commands regarding adding the private key and the certificate, along with some frequently asked questions. Now, let's have a look at the SDK and run sample commands. So we're going to run a validate command and then a QR code generation command. So if we pick this command, so basically you're going to run the command line. And then you're going to navigate to, I'm going to use the samples that we are providing with the SDK. So if you go to data samples, you're going to find various samples. So I'm going to use the standard invoice. So if you go to this path, and then if you run the command fatura-validate-invoice and then pass it the standard invoice XML. So in this example, we have provided a valid XML file. You're going to see that it passed all the validation successfully. Now in the same folder, we have also provided a wrong XML or an XML with an error. So we're going to showcase how this error will be presented in the command line as well. So if we pass it the same command but with the error XML, so we're going to see that it has passed the first validation with the XSD, however it failed in the EN validation. And the result of that is that the message is that it has failed in the business rule -10, which is an invoice shall contain the buyer postal address. So this was one of the requirements, however, it wasn't populated in the XML. Now, another command that we can run, which is the validate QR code, which is a very important command, or generate QR code. So if you run fatura -QR and then pass it the invoice, which is the same invoice that we can use. So the QR code will be generated for you, and this is the final result of the QR code. Of course, it passes multiple stages. This is the final stage of the QR code. You can use this QR code to be used in the XML, or you can use it for printing the QR code on the human readable format. So these are a few examples on how to use the SDK. I would urge you to go through the README file carefully and read all the commands and see how they are used. Now, we're going to use the same samples that we have seen in the web validator. So if you go back to the website, you go to the developer portal, there is a section for web-based validator. Basically here what you can do is that you can drag and drop, or you can upload the XMLs and see if they are valid or not. So let's use the same examples that we have used for the command line. So I'm going to pass the same standard XML format, XML file. And if we do that, you can see that it is successful.